Welcome back to Revere House Radio. I'm your host, Tegan Kehoe. And in this episode, I'm talking with Jessica Dello Russo, who is a neighbor of ours in the North End neighborhood of Boston, and has a background in history and archaeology. At the time we recorded this episode, she was an active board member with the North End Historical Society. She served on the board from 2022 through earlier this year. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you, Tegan. It's great to be here.
So I want to start off by asking, can you tell me about your relationship to the North End?
Yes, my relationship goes back several generations when talking about my family, and that's relevant to me personally because I grew up with really a lot of relatives around the North Square area. And in part, that was because our church was here. We were attending the Sacred Heart Church, which is just across the square, and that my grandfather, great-grandfather actually, Nicola, who was an Italian immigrant, opened a tavern for the sailors right down on Lewis Street. And my family has always maintained, Nina has yet to be convinced.
Yes, Nina, our executive director, always looks at any potential new information about Paul Revere with a researcher's skepticism. But please continue.
My family has maintained that it's on the site of Paul Revere's shop at the tip of Ark's tidal wharf. So we have a library, like thousands of volumes of history of Boston that people have either given us over the years or we've acquired one way or another from both sides of the family. So I grew up really immersed in this awareness of how, what was there to discover in this area? What was there to see, I guess, and understand just by being here and observing.
That's really cool. And my impression is that there was several generations when it was very common in the North End to have a family here for several generations, and that late 19th century through maybe mid to late 20th century, that was common for a lot of families and is a bit less so now. But did you know a lot of people growing up who also had multi-generation roots in this neighborhood?
It's funny, I was kind of caught in the tide between the old traditional kind of North End 3 or 4 generation family in one house, which is, to be honest, still what we have in my building today. My parents, one of my sisters, me and my son, we're, kind of on top of each other. But just to throw out an example, my sister texted me and said, I didn't go to work today. I'm sick to my stomach. I feel pretty dehydrated. Can you, get me some Gatorade? So absolutely, the closeness can really be supportive of each other and kind of keep multi-generational perspective really on life. And that's what I've done for my son. But I grew up in kind of like the bridge between the mid-70s and mid-80s. That was the era that the word yuppie started to be used a lot in the North End because the waterfront, by that point, massive project to requalify, repurpose, I guess, the waterfront was pretty much done, and new people were moving in, including us, because we moved from North Street, hence the being right next to Paul Revere's house. Practically, we moved to Fulton Street, which was previously known, through like the mid-20th century, it was ghost town because a lot of the businesses and major companies that had operated in that area, really because of its vicinity to the freight lines that ran down the waterfront, and also, of course, to Quincy Market. The market moved out, so these businesses likewise. So they had a lot of derelict buildings. So that was the new North End. And even today, I meet people who say, "You're from the North End? I don't remember you." And it was really because one block. Keep in mind, North Street is one street over from Fulton Street. But there was still that memory of it being, a very distinctly business. It would be kind of like living downtown today. And in 2025, my reaction is similar when someone says to me they live on High Street. Those are all skyscrapers and offices. The city moves on, but our habits, we have this strong sense of territory. I'm sure you guys have picked that up.
Yeah. And my impression is that, especially historically, the North End is very kind of hyper-specific in the way that people think of where they're from. And so
street by street. And I really see that some of it's parish by parish. And there used to be more kind of active churches. Sacred Heart, of course, is no longer an active parish. But that was a very distinctive group as opposed to 1 block away, St. Leonard's, which I don't think I even went to until I was maybe in my teens, maybe for a friend's confirmation or something. I had a church.
Right.
And not only that, my grandfather was a member of the St. Mark's Society. So he got to do all of those like boss things, like passing around the collection basket and doing the ushering and stuff. So we always sat in the back and felt very like, we were observing everything around us.
Huh. Yeah, that's great.
But in that little micro world, there was a lot that influenced me in what I did later on. Kind of the way you take your first steps out into the bigger world.
Yeah, no, that's very cool.
The Revere House is actually, because I do remember as a kid going to the Revere House.
Oh, yeah?
That was a great thing because it was like going to my great aunt's attic. She had a horsehair mattress. She had all these very old Victorianish knickknacks. Yeah, it was another way you could kind of identify with the Revere family, is that they were like any family who has, many generations in the same place and a lot of, not junk, but, objects around that you could tell stories about.
Yeah, absolutely. I often hear visitors in the house remarking that some piece of furniture or the floral pattern in the slipcovers on the furniture reminds them of something their grandmother had. And I'm thinking, your grandmother was definitely not alive in the American Revolution. You are not that old. But styles are cyclical, for one. And so something that your grandmother had gone out of fashion and come back in again. And then there are some things that they had a practical reason for being done a certain way. And then technology has changed, and so there isn't that necessity anymore. But those practical reasons sometimes were around in our grandparents' day, or I think the different styles of mattress is an example of that. That's not necessarily a style that has come in and out, but just...
It should come back because pet peeve here for my fellow North Enders, man, we throw away hundreds of mattresses a year.
Yes.
Putting them out in the curb. So maybe we should go back to Revere's straw mattress or horsehair or whatever.
Yeah.
And keep it maybe a little bit longer or unstuff it.
Right. Yeah. Unstuff and restuff, which was often what they would do in Revere's day. Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. And we touched on this a little bit, but the North End has seen a lot of changes in the past, 50 years or so. And of course, it has been changing for centuries. I mean, when Paul Revere lived here, this was the main neighborhood of Boston. And so it didn't have that hyper specificity. Everyone was living on top of everyone else. Paul Revere lived 2 blocks away from the governor's mansion. And then it was a newcomer neighborhood for really all of the 19th century. And then the Italian newcomers put down roots in a way that other immigrant groups hadn't in the North End for quite some time.
I mean, Revere was a walker. He wouldn't have thought twice about his store was up around Cornhill for a while, I think. And then he moved around his real estate. I want to say Union Street for a while. He might have had a shop there.
Yeah,
he never stopped moving.
Right, his hardware store, and then later the business offices of his foundry and his copper business. So lots of things going on.
My feeling is like the North End, yes, was physically distinct, but people walked then. And yeah, I mean, the transformation, just thinking about Revere's house, not just this house, which you guys have beautifully documented the different tenants that occupied that space, because of course it was built after Revere's death, on land, probably remains of his back gardens.
Yes, yeah. So our visitor center, which is where we're recording right now, was built in 1835.
Yeah. And he died in 1818. What fascinates me is his other house. I always think, what would the Paul Revere house be like if it had been the other house, that brick mansion.
Yeah, that
right off
1800.
Similarly, he was not the first occupant of the house, but it was a 3-story brick. His estate records show what was inside it, some of which is here. Although not the Washington urn, I would always love to see. There's this I think it's Esther Forbes, who's, wonderful Paul Revere and the world he lived in. She describes the presence of this giant marble urn in the parlor, which he was proud of his revolutionary patriot roots.
Yeah,
that was a sign. But just to say, what kind of Revere would that have presented? Yeah. And it's always kind of, this Revere, the Revere of North Square.
He's humbler than the later in life Revere.
Maybe. I mean, this towering ambition. I mean, this guy did not take failure. And I think that's why North Enders, his popularity remained as a figure, because despite his mother's connections, he was self-made. I mean, he had that fierce, maybe even competitive sense of achievement through his family. I mean, that's something a lot of as children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants, that means something, that somebody rose up, ultimately send some of their kids at least to Harvard to give them the best education or opportunity that they possibly could have. So there's a lot of respect for the Revere, but having this little wooden house, really emphasizes that.
Yeah. And I think that we often think, oh, would Paul Revere recognize the Paul Revere House today? Because as a museum, we've had to recreate some things. Some things are very accurate, and we know that because they haven't changed or because they've been furniture that belonged to Paul Revere. And some things are, something that is evocative of what he would have had, that's from the period but didn't belong to him, for example. But just thinking about the neighborhood, there are a lot of ways in which this neighborhood is wildly different from his time. Maybe conceptually he would get, okay, so it's this multi-use neighborhood with a lot of different businesses, a lot of different people with various relationships to the neighborhood are living here. So those things might feel familiar to him. But I guess it might depend on what kind of a historical view he wanted to take. In your time in the North End, we touched a bit about what was going on in your childhood, but what changes have made the biggest impression on you in the last number of decades here in the North End?
For me, because I have a very strong personal connection, it's always going to be first and foremost memories of people, even more than, strangely enough, because I'm an archaeologist. But for me, not seeing the people of my childhood, I can conjure up very vividly. A lot more Italian was spoken. There still is a strong elderly presence, but that was something that you would see in stores. If I went to the meat market up the street on Richmond, there used to be Andy's Meat Market, where Villa Francesca is today, and Rico, the butcher, and his associate, they always had guys in there. It was just, not just a store where you sold meat like the Salmona today on Parmenter, but, these guys would be on benches and then they'd sit there and talk or just watch people come in and, like me, and do the daily errands after school.
So it was a social place as well, it sounds like.
There was a lot of socializing in that sense, overlapping again between generations. There's a little bit less of that. Definitely people's work lives have influenced how they come in and out of the neighborhood. I mean, there's a huge exodus, like I saw today at 8 o'clock in the morning, people heading downtown or maybe toward the direction of the hospitals or wherever. But yeah, when my mother first came to the North End, just to emphasize this point, she was from the West End, which is not too far away.
No, it's walking distance.
It's Revere walking distance.
Yeah.
But she, from an Irish, English, German background, basically red hair, blue eyes, I don't resemble her. She was puzzled. She's like, why are all these people outside during the day? Aren't they at work? She didn't understand. And, when I was very young, it was just before the finishing of what's now Christopher Columbus Park. So the nearest playground was North Square. And yeah, that was one of the places where she would just be sitting there watching me kind of, I don't know what I would have done in North Square, just crawled on the cobblestones or swung on the chains. I remember doing that. And she said sometimes she'd feel this tug at her long red hair and she'd turn around and somebody was just like pulling it. It was just so extraordinary to see this bright red haired person in the middle of North Square.
Yeah. That's interesting. She's being treated as a novelty almost.
Yeah, but she got, she was with my dad, so she got the connection through my grandfather, who was a tough guy at a tavern. You knew who she was.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, you mentioned that you're an archaeologist, and I know you also have some background in historic preservation. Can you tell me briefly the story of your career, and do you see any connections between your research and your understanding of North End history, even though I know the North End isn't what you were researching particularly?
This is a great question because, yes, I can trace it all the way back to being in the North End.
Yeah.
And that's the only way it makes sense to say, yes, I studied archaeology at the Vatican. My research interest was and is, for my dissertation, catacombs used by Jews. The Christian catacombs, the ones with the saints and the popes buried early Christian, like 3rd, 4th, 5th century, they tend to be better known and easier to visit. But when I was a kid in the North End, and I have like tangible proof of this, I was really fascinated by the visualization of what seemed to be really ancient stuff. Sacred Heart, like St. Leonard's today, both of them still have multiple statues and side chapels. In the statuary, I mean, it's plaster, it's painted, it's gaudy, it's remnants of the Italian village folk religion, really. But it, led to a real interest in the antiquity of these beliefs, how old these beliefs and how emotional, people were really emotionally attached to them. So I wanted to understand, why religion doesn't die, so to speak, at least not in the North End. I mean, if you're here for a couple of weekends during the summer, it's extraordinary to see these processions out in the streets, because the saints' feasts have changed. They've become definitely like, I don't remember, cigar guy here, or I don't remember quite as many souvenir stands when I was a kid, but much more frying grease. There's a lot of that still. And the other thing is, just even the stores, everything was just very, things, kind of connected me to place. And that's why I was interested in archaeology, because having things or looking at artifacts helped me conceptualize unwritten kind of history that's communicated. The logic of it all, I guess, or the sense of it, like they would have needed to do this. They wouldn't have had plastic. They would have had to have, obviously, vessels in different materials. How would they get them? And
something you mentioned earlier about the Italian churches here, I remember, because I'm not from the North End, when I first started working here, I visited some churches and was struck by just the brightness of color and the amount of color in the Italian Catholic tradition, which is so different from other congregations that I've visited, both around here and in other parts of the world. It's striking, it's bright, and I feel like that is present in some of the other things, like the saints' feasts that you mentioned and the festivals that are just kind of very bright and vivacious. Your research is catacombs, which I imagine are not necessarily bright. I'm kind of imagining that just striking visual culture would leave a real impact or a real impression growing up, and then if you're starting to study material culture in other ways.
Yeah, these stories often go back, like St. Lucy, go back to the time of the catacombs, or Santa Agrippina from Sicily. Qualifier here, I am not of Sicilian descent, so I come from family north and south of Italy, Piacenza, and Chiusano di San Domenico. The Chiusanesi don't have their own feast anymore. Montefalcione, which is the next town over, has St. Anthony's, so maybe I could be adopted into that clan. But just saying that these were traditions kind of brought here, some of it out of necessity. There's that story that you could always tell a Bostonian because they would know what was representative on the weather vane at Faneuil Hall. If they said grasshopper, you knew that they were the real deal.
Right.
These saints, they represented really a whole network of assistance, sodality, financial as well, that, was perpetuated, and in some ways still is perpetuated, more as a social network today than a business club, but it's still big business. Going back to what you mentioned about the pageantry of this, it really was the way that they express their success, I guess, in this culture. Keeping in mind that constant go back and forth. Several of my uncles would travel, great uncles would travel back and forth for business. A lot of, if you're in liquor importing or fruit importing, you often needed to make these business trips and leave the family behind, of course. When did it become less Italian? I guess when there was more property ownership here. People were a little bit more settled. The idea of coming here, working, and then returning back and, retiring with a nice little plot of land back in the home village was less appealing even. Although today I'm sure most people would, a lot of people would love that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And today there are also a lot of people who have really deep roots in the North End, but who are now in the Boston suburbs where they live. And so they do have that plot of land and they're not all living on top of one another. And I know that there's different cultural reactions to that, and true not just for the North End but for many places. Are you with your roots, or are you in a place where you can spread out? And both of those things have their advantages. But
it's funny, the Historical Society really, people respond to it often from, are engaged in it precisely because it helps them reconnect to their roots. Just yesterday, actually, I got a package in the mail from Rochester, New York. And I open it, and it is a professor who wrote a whole article about his ancestor, who was one of the founding members of St. Mark's Society, which was behind the acquisition and creation of Sacred Heart Church as an Italian church. So yeah, he was doing genealogical research, and Boston, of course, is now the home of American ancestors.
Yeah, the Genealogy Center.
You're going to get a lot more people like wanting to explore their colonial roots, or maybe certainly getting more information about their, where their ancestors may have lived in different parts. So yeah, it's definitely, people have more questions. They're not just walking around with a guidebook, looking at the sites.
Yeah, they're looking for their connection to the site. That's cool. It's funny you mentioned Rochester, because my family is not Italian American, but my mom grew up in an Italian neighborhood in Rochester. Small world in that way.
Yeah, they have a great genealogical society there, though.
Oh,
so this article was published in Proceedings of, I guess they have a workshop for genealogy. I think he did a great job. He hasn't even been to he's been to the lower part of Sacred Heart, but I'm like, come on back. We're going to get you back for a Zoom lecture or something, or in person, and hear what, hopefully he can encourage others to, really write it all down, because right now I love, I do a lot of Facebooking for the Historical Society, because sometimes it's the only way people will open their mouth and share.
And it's that informal kind of setting where they feel like they can do that.
Yeah.
So tell me more about the North End Historical Society, and tell our listeners who, I know a bit about it. But, yes. Can you give us some background? How long has it been around, and what's the organization's mission?
Yes, as a nonprofit, it was founded in its current form, because there have been historical societies in the past in the North End. I think the Bicentennial, there was one active at that time. But without the internet in 75, 76, it kind of vanished. This time, we were incorporated in 2009.
Okay.
The board of directors, we still have one of the founding members on our board. Some people have moved to different places or retired and moved to farther away places. So the current board is really a mix of former North Enders, North End residents, and current North Enders. And that really, represents pretty much a lot of our broader membership. We have over 300 members right now who are, registered members, and many more, I guess, because I meet them sometimes at events or other events in Boston, and they go, "Oh yeah, you guys, I'm on your news list, your mailing list or something." So, a lot more out there. In the beginning, the museum wasn't the main focus. What it really was is, one, to get an actual historical society together. There really hadn't been one for decades, and we were lucky to have our original founder had just published what I think is a really well done guide on the North End. His name is Alex Goldfeld. And Alex did his master's thesis at UMass Boston in public history. So not only did he have a lot of the scholarly tools and work experience, because he came to us as the director of visitor services at the African American Museum up on Beacon Hill, he also had this, public historian's commitment to bringing this history, or engaging people with the history. So our mission statement really reflects that we try to bring people to the table who have knowledge or stories to share. And that still has remained our kind of foundational message. Mostly in the early years, up until like 2015 or so, a lot of it was just historical society visits. We went to wonderful places. Paul Revere, we got a sneak preview of your visitors center.
Oh yeah,
Nina did the honors. So yeah, several of the directors were connected to Old North, so we were able to, back when it wasn't that common to tour the bell tower, which you can do today pretty much every day. And it's a wonderful experience. And also go to places like Mass Historical. There was, an involved interest in, cultivation of the Italian side, but not just, it was part of a broader vision. But we had the opportunity 2014-15 to collaborate on a documentary. I think it's called Italians of the North End, or North End Italians. And we have it's watchable for free on our YouTube channel.
I actually watched it fairly recently.
Oh, okay.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you. My colleagues at the North End Historical Society who were involved on it, they beat themselves up. I think I recognize a lot of the North End in it, not just the people, but a little bit of the perspective. And the film took up, a lot of, preparing the film and script writing. But then in 2017, the film was done, and, we filled. I remember I was there, I think, at least for a couple of the showings at St. Stephen's, North End Public Library, and seeing the reaction, some of the North Enders of Italian descent started to talk about, wow, like this kind of information, we need to have a museum. And from 2017, that idea started to germinate. And two individuals in particular, now our current president, Tom Damigella, and Anthony Riccio, who passed away in 2022, but he had been director of the North End Senior Center, drop-in center, for several years, maybe 6 or 7 years in the late 70s, early 80s. And he had a wealth of information, many publications on the stories he recorded, or the contacts he made there. They were the two who really started to advocate for, something a bit more permanent, because as a historical society, we had space, but we didn't have a public. And the idea was that maybe rather than an office or lecture space, bring something in that could show, we could show people and engage people with history, not just in special occasions.
Yeah, that's great.
One of my hopes for the North End Museum is that it is a launching pad for really exploring the fact that we basically still have a lot of the physical imprint. Unfortunately, not a lot of the older buildings. As you know, they tore down a 1795 building last year. So, the North End's still not a historical district. Still not. Maybe it never will be. But we have a lot of the street layout, which will help us convey a bit of that. As you said in the beginning, Tegan, the idea of this as a populace neighborhood, and a neighborhood, above all, the presence of people who make it and continue today.
Yeah.
Is a standout in that regard, because you have an education department. Old North now has Old North Illuminated, which has done a lot of digging into their congregants' histories, and not away from the Paul Revere story, but definitely a social experiment. Looking at Old North as kind of a social experiment.
Yeah, and I had Nikki, the executive director of Old North Illuminated, which is the nonprofit running the
their church, their social, their institutions, many of them moved to Beacon Hill. There was still work on the wharves. There was still, business interests in various parts of the North End, which kept, and a school even here, which needs more work done on it, but would have been on Sun Court, perhaps behind or roughly the back of Sacred Heart today, away from the North Square entrance. But that's, there's work in progress really on documenting that as well. Yeah. So it would be a great time to have a dig, at least to help us, going back to what I said about, thinking, having objects kind of spark your imagination, or, ideas about the significance or the reality of life in different centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. Something to us, and
now we're dropping them.
Yeah, and they'll. So whether it's something that will be included in the new museum or not, what's your favorite fact about North End history that most tourists don't hear?
Wow, so many details.
Yeah, you could choose more than one. You could have more than one favorite.
Well, just walking here, I was, what a commute. I walk out my door on Fulton Street. I walk one block down Richmond, and boom, I'm at North Street and practically at the foot of North Square, close to the Paul Revere House. And it's a beautiful day today. The weather is gorgeous out. And I looked up to the sky, but I also saw at the corner right above Sarasi's liquor store that sign that says WTS 16, I think it's 1654 or something, and then rebuilt 1850. And it just, there's no plaque or any sort of historic tombstone kind of marker to explain what it is. But yeah, it marks the site of the old Red Lion Inn. And Wadsworth, of course, is a name that it was on my mind approaching the Paul Revere House, because it reminds us, that Longfellow's, some of his roots go back to this area, which ties into what you said at the beginning about the North End being an important residential area for early Boston. Boston was at times the major port of the English colonies in America. Larger than Philadelphia for a while, I guess, before the French and Indian War, and New York, of course, other, big seaports. So, yeah, we're looking for ways to identify just the small, half a square mile territory with a much broader picture of America. What other fun facts? Oh, my goodness. Well, I've been in touch recently with somebody else who thinks they've solved the mystery of the pirate tunnels. And that always comes up.
Tell us about
the
that
smugglers.
mystery.
Oh, the smugglers' tunnels. There are stories that crop up in North End that between the old North End waterfront, which would now be like the North End Parks, like Copp's Hill Park, there used to be tunnels leading up the hill, Copp's Hill, or at the foot of the hill, ending in some accounts have it somebody's grave, somebody's basement. The basement of Old North, which Nikki says is not true. She's assured me of that. But, it's fun to see that, North Enders of today adopt these stories and they get, I wouldn't say better with the telling, but they tell them their way.
Right.
And there was recently somebody else has made the claim that they have tunnels ending in their basement. It looks a little bit like a stove nook, but I'm just going to keep quiet if I want my neighbors to speak to me. But yeah, people, they just like hearing story because it's such an easy place with all of these, these streets that some of them curve and some of them turn a blind corner or finish, these little byways. You can see some of them through the gates. There's always a sense of, there's more to discover here, and we're doing it. We're trying.
Yeah. Can we backtrack a moment? You mentioned the building that was I think you said Red Lion Inn. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh my goodness. I love it because Nicholas Upsall was associated with that site. And he is another guy I wish we talked about more because he was very open to, he's noted for offering assistance to Quakers who were imprisoned and harassed moving to Boston or coming to Boston in the mid 17th century. And in the end, he also came to be, suffered persecution, but he was similarly, upbraided by the authorities for bringing them food in prison, for assisting them. So he's buried in Copp's Hill. So you can see, I like to go to Copp's Hill sometimes and just read the names on the tombstones, because it reminds me that these people like me today, like my neighbors, they had full lives here.
Right.
And such interesting lives in many ways. So as we know, Revere is not here.
Right. He's not too far away.
No, and on the Freedom Trail, you come across Revere constantly. A little bit like Ben Franklin at the beginning. You see his family's tomb, then you come across a statue, then you see his church, birthplace around the corner. So yeah, but there are many more people out there who, fortunately, this was a literate population. We have... Right,
there are records that not everyone has, not every place has.
And I wish we knew more, but archaeology might be able to tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am hesitant to switch us back to Paul Revere, because we were just talking about how great it is to be able to tell these lesser known stories or to ponder the unknown stories. But do you have, having lived so much of your life adjacent to where Paul Revere was, do you have a favorite either Paul Revere fact or Paul Revere House fact or story about your experiences here?
Oh man, I always think his house over on Charter Street, the one we mentioned earlier, as being kind of the success story, when Paul Revere was wealthy enough to really afford a freestanding brick mansion. After his death, pretty soon after his death, I think 1819, it became the home for penitent women. So it was actually a lot of the guests were reformed prostitutes. And it was, if I remember correctly, they have records of it through like the early 1840s. And then unfortunately it was torn down. I guess they figured the real estate would be better, or you'd earn more off the land by turning it into like separate residence. One building plot, you could get 3 houses for Irish immigrants out of it, or whoever was, moving down to that dock area. What's another favorite? Of course, it's, my dad's lifelong friend, Ralph Del Gaudio, and his stories about how he had Paul Revere's kitchen in the basement of his store, which, as you know, is right next door, the gift shop today. So when we were kids, Ralph, who, his family's business originally clocks, jewelry, he would take us down into the basement, and hey, the foundation still had traces of the old brick arches. And,
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was really neat. So that was like basically the twin to the Paul Revere.
Kind of a row house type of situation.
Exactly. And I know that thanks to the North Square Stories, that group of 4 different sculptures that's in North Square today. There's one perspective where you're looking down North Square the way it was perhaps, around like 1775, and you can see the 2 houses kind of like twins. So yeah, I don't know if it's true, but it shows that, Ralph's kind of proximity to Revere, he really enjoyed the telling of the story. And yeah, and one of my North End Historical Society co-directors, Vito Alulia, similarly, he can recite the whole spiel that tour buses used to be able to come right to North Square and unload.
The tour buses must have been narrower at the time.
Oh, they seem to have been like Volkswagen buses. I mean, that's the only explanation. But if there was a way to do it, they did it. So yeah, he said the first one to get them would be following them and telling this, and they'd do it at Copp's Hill similarly, right around the entrance to the Copp's Hill burial ground. But Revere, oh my goodness, just walking down North Street today. Do you see the new Revere? He's now an exercise studio mascot.
Yes, yeah. Revere turns up on all kinds of things in the North End, just various depictions of him. I've seen him on compost buckets. I think he's holding a carrot in that one, in the compost bucket.
Yep. Be a good neighbor. He's still our mascot today.
Yes.
And that's a great thing, because I think he's a good guy to know, understand or know. And we're lucky we do know a lot about him.
Yeah.
Thanks to you guys.
Yeah, and I think that Paul Revere was very good at being kind of everywhere in Boston and giving the impression that he was kind of everywhere. So it's sort of fun that in the North End, he's still kind of everywhere in a very different sense. Obviously, he's not getting any silversmith business by being on a compost bucket or an exercise studio, but he's everywhere in a different way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Jessica. And we will be linking in the show notes to more information about the North End Historical Society so that folks can learn more.
Please do. Get in touch. We're here.
Yeah, so. The museum space is, a block and a half from here. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
We'll be neighbors.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. Right around the corner.
And before we wrap up today, we have the last two of our high school interns who granted me a little micro interview at the end of their internship. Welcome to the podcast. Can you tell us your name?
I'm Erin Campbell.
And what's one or two things that you learned about history this week?
Something that I found really interesting about the history that I learned this week was the multitude of perspectives and angles that you could take on it, especially when presenting it in a museum. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was really interesting how different people interpreted it, especially as we observed the people that walked through the museum and like what they noticed and what they picked up. Mm-hmm. It really helped me to understand how people are presenting information and how you can present it in an effective way that most people will like pick up or find interesting.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to the podcast. Could you tell us your name and just tell us one or two things that you've learned about history this week?
Of course. My name's Elena Zaganyori, and something really interesting I've learned about history is more in the vein of how to think about history. We talked a lot during the week about the use of historical mythology and how that connects to sort of cultural themes and values. So what Paul Revere represents not just in American history, but in general in American cultural heritage and the way we think about our national identity. So that was something that was really interesting for me because I hadn't really thought about that, about how historical mythology happens and really analyzing the way that we tell stories and how stories get passed down. But then in particular, a fact that really stood out to me was how many children Paul Revere had. Mm-hmm. First of all, because it's really astonishing, 16 children, but also because it was so interesting to see so many guests pounce on that particular fact. So many people are interested in that fact. That was such a common question. Like, he had 16 children. So that interested me. It piqued my interest, but it was also very interesting to see how it piqued everyone else's interests, especially when I was observing.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to Revere House Radio. I'm your host, Tegan Kehoe, and I am the Research and Adult Program Director here at the Paul Revere House. Our production team for this season includes Derek Hunter, Mehita Glenhaber, and Adrian Turnbull-Riley. Thank you to R.P. Hale for the use of his performance on the harpsichord as our theme music. If you're listening online, we encourage you to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Revere House Radio is a production of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, the nonprofit which operates the Paul Revere House Museum. You can find more information, subscribe to our mailing list or social media, or become a member on our website at www.paulreverehouse.org. Or come visit us in Boston.